Thank you all for having me and for coming to this part of the talk. Something really special is being built in Brazil, and it's cool to be a part of it. We've heard a lot of great talks about Bitcoin today and yesterday, and I'm going to talk about talking about Bitcoin. So there will be a little bit about Bitcoin and then a lot about talking about Bitcoin. In my role as a professor and as the director of the Bitcoin Research Institute, I've spent a lot more time talking to people who don't already have an understanding of Bitcoin than I have to people who do. Conferences are great. Conferences like this are great for getting together and finding the things in common that we have and meeting with like-minded people. And then that can actually make it harder to talk to people who don't understand what Bitcoin is about Bitcoin. So some of you will already know the things that I'm going to talk about, but maybe will have forgotten them. And some of you maybe haven't really talked to non-Bitcoiners about Bitcoin in a while. And so this will serve hopefully as a helpful guide for you as you go out into the world. And if we all talk about Bitcoin to one person and we bring them here next year, then this venue won't be big enough for all of the Bitcoiners that show up. So there have been several surveys that have asked people about their experience with Bitcoin, and roughly, depending on the survey, roughly 95% of the people in the world have heard of Bitcoin by this point. It's not a totally unfamiliar term anymore to most people. And then the follow-up question is, do you have any? How do you interact with it? And do you intend to get any? And depending again on the survey, roughly 60% of people say they will never buy Bitcoin. Not just that they don't have an intention right now to acquire Bitcoin, but that they have an intention never to get any Bitcoin. And a really natural question for us might be, why? This is a really important question to answer. If we don't know why people aren't interested in getting Bitcoin, why they intend never to get any, then we won't be able to explain to them what we value about Bitcoin, and we won't be able to help them on their journey. I don't know about you, but it took several times of hearing about Bitcoin before I got interested enough to research it for myself and then end up starting to use it. Very few people, the first time that they hear about Bitcoin, will end up getting it immediately. Both getting it mentally, like understanding it, and also getting it by acquiring it. And we have a great opportunity to help bring people closer to Bitcoin. We also have the opportunity of pushing them away. So if it takes multiple times of hearing about Bitcoin for someone to understand it, and the first time they talk to you about it, they never want to talk to you again about it, then that means someone else in their life has to do the other bunch of times talking about it with them. So I'm going to talk about some reasons that people cite, both in my own experience and then also in surveys, for not being interested in Bitcoin. And then I'm not going to respond to each of the points, but I'm going to give some sort of general principles for how we should think about responding to people. So I think there's at least two families of barriers that people have when it comes to Bitcoin. And you could give them different labels, but one group is personal. It has to do with them, their own attitudes, their own experiences, their own situation, and specifically how Bitcoin relates to them. And then the other is objections to Bitcoin itself. Problems that they have with the protocol, worries that they have about the asset, etc. And these are importantly different. You might have one but not have the other. You might, for example, believe in Bitcoin, think it sounds amazing and awesome, but also be really worried about getting it yourself. Or you might actually really want it because you believe that the value of it is going to go up, but you have deep issues with the protocol, with the economics, something like that. So two distinct families that can come apart. So I'm going to talk about some of the particular personal barriers and systemic objections that people have. And these, again, come in their own varieties. So the varieties of personal barriers that I've had people appeal to are these and perhaps some more. So maybe you know more than I do. But at least these 5. So there's the user experience. You have someone download a Bitcoin wallet, and they're just kind of overwhelmed at what it looks like, what's happening. The other is the price. They've been hearing about Bitcoin for a while, and each time they look it up, it has a wildly different price in their own local currency. Another problem is the risk. What if I lose my private keys? What if I'm hacked? What if? Bitcoin is a risk I don't need to take. Another one has to do with use cases. How am I going to use Bitcoin? And then finally, this is the one that comes at the end. Because of all these other ones, I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing. It's inertia. So here are some user experience questions that people have asked me as I've gone around giving talks in Wyoming and other places to non-Bitcoiner audiences. How do I get it? This is a hard question to answer, right? There's a lot of places to get Bitcoin. Some of them seem suspicious. It's almost an overwhelming amount of options right now. And if you don't already work for a Bitcoin company, you might actually hesitate to recommend one company over another. You hesitate to put your own stamp of approval on it. What do I do with it once I get it? What do you do with it? How do you use it? Who do you send it to? Which wallet should I get? There's a lot of Bitcoin wallets. The last time I gave this talk, someone came up to me, was very excited, said, I've been thinking about getting Bitcoin for 5 years. I finally got it on Venmo last week. And I said, I'm sorry, but you don't have Bitcoin. You have a number on a screen that tells you how much Bitcoin they're holding for you, but that's not your Bitcoin. She had no idea, right? She had not been told anything about different Bitcoin wallets. Venmo was a company that she trusted, so she got her Bitcoin from there. So then she asked, well, what happens when I use Venmo versus these other wallets that you're talking about? What's going on in a wallet? What does a wallet do? I set up the wallet that you told me to set up, and it gave me 12 or 24 words, and it told me not to take a screenshot of them, but I'm supposed to write them down, and it's really important. What am I supposed to do with these? This is really weird. I've never been in this situation before. What do these words mean? What happens if I lose the words? What happens if someone else gets the words? So we've had talks here about user experience. It frequently comes up at Bitcoin conferences. It's an acknowledged problem, and I will say it's a problem that we've done quite a bit to solve as a Bitcoin community. The user experience of acquiring and using Bitcoin now versus 10 years ago is just amazing. It's getting so much more like using other apps that we're familiar with. So great strides are happening in this area. But we still need to go further. The Human Rights Foundation acknowledges that they're giving out grants still for people that are improving user experience on Bitcoin, making it easier and more straightforward to use. So this is a huge class of problems that immediately I've had people who have been really interested in the talks that I've given. They've downloaded a wallet, and they've immediately decided, I'm not going to interact with this thing. Second one is price. So this mostly happens when I get panicked calls from people that I've talked to before about Bitcoin. I bought it, and now it's way down. Should I sell it? Or I bought it, and now it's way up. Should I sell it? The problem isn't losing value. The problem is just how quickly the value changes. Also, people who have zoomed out and seen the long view realize there were people that were telling me to buy Bitcoin when Bitcoin was $250. Now it's over 100,000. Clearly, I've missed the boat. It's too late. And then this prompts them to go look for some other cryptocurrency that they can invest in. This is especially true of my students, 18 to 22-year-olds who are trying to save for the future, but feel like it's hopeless, that they're never going to be able to afford a house or a family, and their only chance is to hit the lottery. And the lotteries that they're familiar with these days are viral videos and crypto tokens. Obviously, it's too late for Bitcoin, but what's the next one? What's the next one that's going to pump? Then there's some misunderstandings of how the price even gets set. And finally, what happens if Bitcoin goes to zero? Under what conditions would Bitcoin go to zero? How do we know what the value is going to be in the future? These put people off as well. Risks. So there are systemic risks, there are custodial risks, and there are risks of user error. So price is a kind of systemic risk, but there are other risks inherent to the system, right? We just had a talk about quantum computing and whether that could break Bitcoin. I get this a lot. What if someone, once the value gets high enough, what if someone just hacks the network? These people don't know what hacking is, but they know it's a thing that happens. And since Bitcoin is a computer thing, clearly it should be able to be hacked. And all that's missing is motivation, apparently. The more technically astute among us might chuckle at this. People who have maybe done any actual hacking, people who know the history of attempts to hack Bitcoin. But for people who don't have this experience, which is the vast majority of people that you're going to be talking to, these are very real concerns. There's risk of custodians. So if I leave my Bitcoin on a custodian, like Venmo or something else, what do they do with it? How do I know this company's going to last? If I don't leave it with them and I take it myself, what happens if I make a mistake? What if I lose these private keys? What if I accidentally send Bitcoin to the wrong address? Who do I talk to? Who's the president of Bitcoin that I can write who does customer service? How do I write an email and get my Bitcoin back? There's problems of use cases, right? I don't have any friends that use Bitcoin. So what am I going to do with it? How am I going to send it? How do I spend it? I've looked up all the places that accept Bitcoin, and there are none in my area. So I can't buy anything with it, and I can't pay my friends in it. So what's the point? Everything that I need to do, I can do with Apple Pay, PayPal, Venmo, etc. So what's in it for me? And finally, inertia. I've lived my whole life. This mostly comes from older people, right? Younger people are much easier to sway. They're more willing to try things. But the older crowd says, I've lived my whole life without this thing. I don't totally understand it. Seems a little bit risky. I don't need it. My life's going okay. Seems like it's going to take a lot of work. Seems really easy to make mistakes. So, you know what? I'll sit back and wait and see. And then if it gets easier to use, if the price gets a little more stable, etc., then maybe I'll jump in. So these are all things that I've had people say either in a Q&A at a talk that I've given or to my face as reasons why they don't already own Bitcoin. And then it's up to me. Do I try to convince them to get Bitcoin? Do I explain it to them? Do I just nod my head and say, yeah, seems reasonable, maybe you should stay away? I'll get to that after the systemic objection. So there's a lot of people who understand how Bitcoin might personally benefit them, but still have worries about the asset or the protocol or the system itself. And these come in some forms. So we have systemic objections of Bitcoin's relationship to the environment. This was a very popular one and still quite popular even as Bitcoin has made advances in its energy use and things like that. We have worries that Bitcoin is a bubble, a Ponzi scheme, mere speculation. Bitcoin is used by criminals and in scams, in ransomware, things like that. worries about how Bitcoin relates to the government, which come in two different varieties. One is the government can't control it, and that's bad. The other is the government can control it, and that's bad. I've heard both. And finally, worries about Bitcoin perpetuating wealth inequality. So these aren't issues that individuals have with their own relationship to Bitcoin, but rather Bitcoin and its relationship to the world. So environmentally, you get facts like Bitcoin uses more energy than Argentina. And then the implicit assumption is, that's bad. Bitcoin is contributing to climate change. Bitcoin miners are raising electricity costs for people. And really what underlies all these things is this idea that Bitcoin is unnecessary. It's using this energy, it's using electricity, and it's not a really important use of electricity. Right? We don't hear, for example, Argentina uses almost as much energy as Bitcoin. That's bad. Because we think Argentina is a good thing. It should exist. They should use electricity. So the implicit assumption is that Bitcoin is doing all this in an either wasteful way or an unnecessary way. Economists love to give this objection to Bitcoin, that it's a bubble, a Ponzi scheme, that its value is propped up purely by speculation. They point out that Bitcoin has no intrinsic value. There's nothing backing it. It doesn't give cash flow. You don't have a share in a company or anything like that. Unlike, of course, gold or dollars or stocks in companies. And the only way to profit off of Bitcoin is to sell it. You can't hold on to Bitcoin and benefit from it. You have to, at some point, sell it to someone else, and that's bad. I confess I don't totally understand all of these objections, but since I've heard them, I'm passing them on. Third, Bitcoin is used in dark markets, assassinations, drugs, etc. One that I got very frequently after the collapse of FTX was that Bitcoin played some role in the downfall of FTX. And not only that it's because of Bitcoin that companies like FTX fail. Bitcoin is used in ransomware. And it's just, the kind of people that use Bitcoin that I've heard about, I don't want to be associated with them. That's not my kind of people. There's worries about Bitcoin's relationship to the government. So some people say Bitcoin is a threat to the government, so the government will ban it, and then you won't be able to use it. Some people like governments, and they say governments will be weakened by Bitcoin. So as much as I would love to make money off of it, governments do great things. And finally, just a conceptual difficulty with understanding a money that isn't controlled in supply and distribution by the state. And then the final family of objections come from wealth inequality. So you notice the people that are very vocal about Bitcoin on Twitter, etc. People that have the most followers tend to be people who have a lot of Bitcoin. And they tend to be people who are already wealthy before Bitcoin. And the worry is that Bitcoin perpetuates this wealth inequality. It's dominated by a small number of holders who have tons of Bitcoin. And then as price goes up, they tell you to keep holding, and meanwhile, they're selling their own. And in the end, after all this Bitcoin stuff shakes out, wealth inequality is going to be worse than it was beforehand. That's a lot of bad stuff in 30 objections or so. So I'm not going to individually go through these and respond to them. You all probably have your own objections to these objections. You probably have your own responses. You've probably heard some or many of these and maybe responded to people. And maybe that has gone well. Maybe it hasn't gone very well. But I'm not going to tell you what to think about each of these objections. We addressed maybe 40 of them in the book, resistance money. So if you're really interested in what I think, come find me or read the book. I just want to think about some general strategies as to how to approach this. So what do we do when someone that we love, that we care about, that we want to find this financial freedom that we've found, that we want to get wealthy, what do we do if they don't get it? The immediate impulse is, at least mine, is to try to stop them and say, no, that's not something that you need to worry about. I suggest this is a bad impulse. And what we should do instead is agree with them. And even more than agree with them, amplify their concerns. So when someone asks me, how are all these math problems set, and how do the minors coordinate, and what do the nodes do, and what happens when I'm using my wallet? This is just really complicated. I say, you don't even know how complicated it is. It is so much more complicated than you can understand. And then I add a few more complications to show them that I understand where they're coming from. And then maybe I ask them how email works or something. How does the internet work? Isn't that a lot of computers connected? You're right, there are so many wallets. It's so hard to choose between these. And it's so hard to know which ones you can trust. You're right, Bitcoin uses a ton of energy. And if the price keeps going up, it will use even more because it's more profitable to mine. You're right, look at this price chart. Did you realize that Bitcoin went from nothing to $100,000 in 15 years, but over that time, it sometimes dropped 80 or 90%? That's really volatile. So people feel heard and understood when you agree with their concern and you amplify it. If you try to dismiss it, they might think either you're not very much like me, you don't have the concerns that I have, or you just don't get it. You don't understand why people would be concerned about this. And that's not a position that we want to be in if we're trying to help people understand this thing. A second really important strategy is to ask questions. So again, our impulse, even if we agree and amplify, we might say, yeah, it's really complicated, but, and then just launch into a really long explanation or a rant. But I've found that it's really helpful to ask questions. The less people know about Bitcoin, the less they even understand what their questions mean, and sometimes what they're even worried about. They get this vague sense of unease, but they're not sure whether they need to be worried or not. So one question I like to ask is, do you want me to answer your question? Are you looking for an answer, or are you just looking for someone to validate that that is a real concern? One of the ways to turn people off is to explain something that they don't actually want explained to them. Are you interested in learning more? Or are you happy with your current state of understanding? I've agreed that your concerns are valid, and yet I still use Bitcoin. Do you want to know why? And finally, this works better with friends than with just random people who come up to you after a talk that you give, is to indicate your own investment in this emotionally and mentally. This is something that's important to me. This is something I care about. Do you mind if I explain it to you? I really want you to understand it because I've found so much of value in it. So along with agreeing and amplifying, we can strengthen people's objections. So sometimes people have heard things and they give a sort of weak objection, and our immediate impulse is to think, yes, this is an easy one to respond to. Even if there's a much more complicated, deeper objection lurking beneath the surface that we know about, and maybe even that we're worried about. So this happened a lot early on in discussing Bitcoin's effects on the climate. People would say, Bitcoin mining uses coal, or Bitcoin uses more energy than Argentina. And some people would only know one of those two facts. And it would be very easy to say, yeah, Bitcoin uses more energy than Argentina, but I mean, what if it's mostly clean energy? What if it's mostly solar or hydro? You could say that while knowing very well that at that time, at least, it wasn't. So when you strengthen people's objections, it makes you seem more credible. I mean, it makes you more credible. You are a more honest person if you are responding to the very best version of the objection that you know. And this can go along with asking questions too. So I hear your objection that wallets are incredibly complicated. It's actually worse than that. There are some wallets that have shut down and people haven't been able to get their funds back. Did you know that? Can I answer your worries about wallets now? Would you like to hear why I still use Bitcoin, even though this has happened? Some people know that Bitcoin was at one point worth X amount, now it's worth Y, but they don't know about the wild price swings in the past. And you can tell them it's actually been worse. Some people have seen their savings drop 80% in a week. People don't ask these questions and have these objections to Bitcoin for no reason. They're an expression of people's values. And I've talked to people with all sorts of different belief systems, religious, political, etc. And deep down, there's a whole lot of similarity. So one of the things that I like to do is try to identify the value that is behind the question, and then affirm that I also have that value. So I might say, you're worried about Bitcoin's energy use. I suspect that's because you really value our relationship with the environment. I have that value too. Can I share with you some ways that Bitcoin actually makes me optimistic about climate change? Or you've said that you don't like how much Elon Musk tweets about Bitcoin because he has a lot of wealth. I sense that you're worried about wealth inequality. You want things to be more fair, more just. I share that value. Can I talk about how Bitcoin actually helps to amplify the value that you and I share? So if we can start sentences with, we both value X. Can I talk about how Bitcoin relates to X? Not the company X. X as a variable. We both value this thing. Can I talk about Bitcoin's relationship with this thing? People tend to be more open. Sometimes it can be really helpful to point out that people don't have these objections in isolation. The choice isn't just Bitcoin or not, it's Bitcoin or something else. Usually it's Bitcoin or the current system that we are in. And because the current system that we are in is one that we often grew up with, that we're used to, it doesn't surprise us, it can be hard to think about how the current system relates to the concern that we have about Bitcoin. So people might say, I've heard of Bitcoin wallets shutting down and people not being able to get their money back. You might say, yeah, that worries me too. I've also heard about that. Have you ever heard about any banks shutting down? That's another place that people keep their money. People might say, the price of Bitcoin has been so volatile, it just really worries me. And I'll say, yeah, Bitcoin has dropped like 80% sometimes. What do you think the situation is with the US dollar? How has the value of that gone over the last 10 years? Oh, I see Bitcoin has been up and down and the US dollar has been down only. That's interesting. Bitcoin uses a lot of energy. How much energy does the current financial system use? How is our money secured? What kind of energy is used for economic and military domination? One of the things that's most frustrating about Bitcoin, but in a good way, is just how transparent everything is. You know exactly how much hash rate is being used for the Bitcoin network at any given time. You have no idea how much energy and electricity is being used to prop up various government-backed currencies or the financial system as a whole. Those numbers are not readily available. It's hard to even figure out how you'd calculate them. So sometimes it's hard to actually do the comparison. We can point out the comparison class, but we can't do the direct comparison. One of the things that I found, and it makes perfect sense to me because it's how I got into Bitcoin, but that we sometimes forget as we go on, is the importance of stories. The first story that I heard about Bitcoin was still my favorite story about Bitcoin, and it's the story of Roya Maboob, who maybe you've heard this story, maybe you haven't. She ran a technology company in Afghanistan, and she found out that most of the money that she was paying, or in fact all of the money that she was paying to the women who worked for her, they were having to directly, as soon as they got home, hand over to their husbands or fathers, whoever the head of the household was. And because of this, they were often trapped in situations that they couldn't get out of because they had no value stored up that they could bring with them. And so Roya started paying a small extra portion of their wages in Bitcoin and told them not to tell. This is for you and for you alone. Hold on to this. And over time, the value of that Bitcoin grew. It was personal property that the women owned, and it made them financially free. And at least one was able to leave an abusive domestic situation because she could take her Bitcoin with her. So I ask, look, all these worries aside, can I tell you some stories about how people have used Bitcoin to escape domestic violence? Can I tell you how people have used Bitcoin in their fight against authoritarianism in their own country? Can I tell you how Alexei Navalny couldn't get a bank account in Russia because Vladimir Putin kept shutting it down, and so he switched to Bitcoin? Can I tell you about how the Nigeria Feminist Collective is getting donations in Bitcoin and then funding their protests with that Bitcoin? Can I tell you about how Hadia is giving Bitcoin to refugees? How much easier it is to give the Bitcoin than it is to somehow get physical cash into their hands or get them set up with a bank. Do those stories matter to you? And do they make you think that, at least in terms of the systemic objections, maybe Bitcoin is worth it? Maybe we're getting something good from Bitcoin that we can't get in any other way. Maybe it's worth the energy use. Maybe it's worth the volatility. Maybe it's worth all these other things. One strategy that often helps, especially for people who don't understand it very well at all, is to distinguish Bitcoin from crypto. A lot of people's experience with what they think is Bitcoin is in fact not an experience with Bitcoin. And so at the beginning of my talk, I will very often say, I'm not here to talk to you about cryptocurrencies. I couldn't even if I wanted to. There are something like 25 million of them right now. And there will be 50 more that are launched while I'm giving this talk. I only know about one of them, and it's Bitcoin. So I'm going to talk about that. Still, people will come up to me afterwards and either ask me what other cryptos they should get interested in because they've missed the boat on Bitcoin, or tell me some horror story that turns out not to be about Bitcoin at all, but about something that in their mind is Bitcoin, which is actually another crypto. So when they talk about Bitcoin scams, I'll say, what scam are you talking about? I don't know of any scams that crucially relied on Bitcoin. Are you thinking maybe of some other cryptocurrency? Or I'll say, they'll be worried about the governance structure of Bitcoin. What if the president of Bitcoin cashes out or something? And I'll say, oh, well, I can understand why you'd think that. Most cryptocurrencies have a foundation and some insiders, and they engage in some nefarious activities. Bitcoin has a pretty unique origin story and governance structure. Do you mind if I tell you about it? I have not succeeded in converting everyone that I've tried to talk to being in favor of Bitcoin, much less buying Bitcoin. But I think this open attitude towards objections, wanting to think through it with people, wanting to make sure that they're actually interested in the answers, goes a long way in establishing credibility and keeping them open to the possibility of Bitcoin being something that's good for the world or for them, and hopefully both. I think everyone can benefit from having Bitcoin, using Bitcoin, at least knowing how to use Bitcoin. I think it's important, even if you don't end up getting Bitcoin, that you know how to acquire it and how to use it in case you ever need it. And I want people that I talk to be at least open to that possibility. I never want to push them so far away that they could never come back. Thank you so much for listening. This is the book that I wrote with two of my colleagues. There will be a Portuguese translation, I'm told, coming in February or March of 2026. So if you're interested in reading it and you don't want to read it in English, just hold on and wait for a little bit. And there's where you can find some more information about me. Thanks again.